Hello, family of the channel. Before we begin, if this story touches your heart, please leave a like and tell me in the comments which country you are watching from. If you like our content, it is very important that you subscribe to the channel to help us reach more and more people who need to hear testimonies of people who face the greatest difficulty of their lives with Jesus Christ in their hearts. What I am going to tell you today changed my life forever, and I need to share it because I know many of you have gone through something similar. My name is Michael, and I'm 48 years old. For 20 of those years, I was the priest at St. Jude's Church, right here in the small town of Providence. It was my life, my calling, and my family. The people of my congregation were everything to me, and I thought I was everything to them, until one Sunday morning when my entire world was set on fire in front of their eyes. Today, you will get to know my revenge story. I was publicly accused of stealing from the very people I swore to God I would protect. But what my accuser didn't know was that in his attempt to destroy me, he awakened a part of my past that I had long since buried, a past that would become his undoing. Listen to my story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? The day it happened was supposed to be a celebration. We had just finished our annual Hope for the Homeless charity drive, and the community had been more generous than ever. The church was packed, sunlight was streaming through the stained glass windows, and even the bishop had come to celebrate with us. I felt a profound sense of peace standing at the altar, looking out at the faces of people I had baptized, married, and comforted. Then he stood up, Arthur Sterling, a man who was not only wealthy and powerful, but also the head of our church's finance council. He was charismatic, always had a warm smile, and everyone trusted him. He asked to speak, his face a mask of sorrow. He announced that a painful discovery had been made. Over $50,000 from the charity drive was missing. A collective gasp filled the sanctuary. Before I could even process what he was saying, he produced a set of ledgers and bank statements. He explained, with what looked like a heavy heart, that I was the only person with the access and opportunity to have taken the money. The documents he held up were fake, I knew it, but they looked real enough to convince everyone. He looked directly at the bishop and said we needed to ask Father Michael to step down, pending an investigation. I was stunned into silence. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but the shock was too great, and the atmosphere had already turned against me. 2 men from the council, men I had known for years, escorted me from the sanctuary like a common criminal. My last act in the church I had called home was to kneel for a moment at the altar, not to pray for myself, but to pray that the truth would find its way into the light. My life fell apart overnight. I was stripped of my duties and forced to leave the rectory. My name was all over the local news, my face associated with theft and betrayal. People who used to greet me with a warm hug now crossed the street to avoid me. The weight of a crime I didn't commit was crushing, and I felt a loneliness so deep it felt like a physical ache. Beneath all the shame, though, a different feeling began to grow, a cold, quiet anger. I had to find work, any work. I ended up as a night janitor at a warehouse on the edge of town. Mopping floors in the dead of night was a world away from leading a congregation. One evening, I was at the supermarket, and I saw a young family I had personally helped through a very difficult time. The parents saw me, grabbed their kids' hands, and quickly turned down another aisle, their children looking back at me with fear in their eyes. That was the moment my despair turned into resolve. You see, before I answered God's call to join the seminary, I had a very different life. For 10 years, I worked as a forensic accountant for a big firm in Chicago. I was good at it, too. I could follow a money trail through the most complex webs of deception. I left that world behind because I wanted to serve people, not corporations. But now I realized that God had given me those skills for a reason, for a time just like this. That night, in my small, empty apartment, I opened my Bible. My eyes fell upon a verse in the book of Luke. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. It wasn't a call for divine wrath. It felt like a direct instruction. I wasn't just going to wait for justice. I was going to become its instrument. Arthur Sterling thought he had silenced a humble priest, but he had just declared war on an expert who knew exactly how to uncover his sins. My name is Michael, and I am 48 years old. For 20 years, I served as the priest at St. Jude's, a place I called home and a community I considered my family. But that all ended on a bright Sunday morning, when I was publicly accused of stealing from the very people I had sworn to God to protect. What my accuser didn't realize was that in his attempt to destroy me, he awakened a part of my past I thought was long buried. Listen to my story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? The day my world crumbled was supposed to be a celebration. We had just finished our annual Hope for the Homeless charity drive, raising a record amount. The church was full, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, and even the bishop was there. I felt a deep sense of peace standing at the altar, until Arthur Sterling, the powerful head of our finance council, stood up. With a face full of fake sorrow, he announced that over $50,000 from the charity drive was missing. A shocked silence fell over the congregation. Before I could even process his words, Arthur held up a stack of doctored ledgers and fake bank statements. He explained with a heavy heart that I was the only person with the access and opportunity to have taken the money. His voice was steady and convincing, as he laid out his fabricated evidence. He looked directly at the bishop and then at the congregation, his eyes full of false pity, and said that for the good of the church, I needed to step down immediately while an investigation was conducted. I was frozen, completely speechless. The faces that had looked at me with love and respect just moments before were now filled with confusion, suspicion, and betrayal. I tried to form the words to defend myself, to shout that it was all a lie, but my voice wouldn't work. The weight of hundreds of accusing stares pressed down on me, suffocating me. In that instant, I was no longer their spiritual guide. I was a thief, a wolf who had preyed on his own flock. Two men from the council, men I had known for years, walked up to the altar and gently but firmly escorted me away. It was the most humiliating walk of my life. As they led me out of the sanctuary, I stopped for one last moment and knelt at the altar. I didn't pray for myself or for my name to be cleared. I closed my eyes and whispered a single prayer, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would one day be brought into the light. That moment changed everything. The rectory door clicked shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the empty hallway. All I had was a small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, my Bible, and the crushing weight of a life that had vanished in a matter of minutes. The home where I had prayed, slept, and shared meals for 2 decades was no longer mine. I was an outcast, a stranger in the only place I had ever truly belonged. The silence was the worst part. It was a void where the sounds of a community used to be. The bishop's call came that evening. His voice was formal, distant, stripped of the warmth we once shared. He spoke of procedure, of the diocese's reputation, of the need for a thorough and impartial investigation. He didn't ask if I was okay or where I was going. He simply informed me that my clerical duties were suspended indefinitely and that I was not to have any contact with the parishioners of St. Jude's. It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict delivered by a man I once considered a mentor. I found a room in a cheap motel on the highway, the kind with flickering fluorescent lights and thin walls. I lay on the lumpy mattress that night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying Arthur's words over and over. Every confident lie, every feigned look of sorrow was seared into my memory. Sleep was impossible. The peace I had always found in prayer was gone, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. God felt 1,000,000 miles away, and I had never felt more alone. The next morning, my face was on the front page of the Providence Gazette. The headline was brutal: "Local priest accused of stealing from homeless fund." They used a photo from last year's Christmas service, where I was smiling, surrounded by children. Now that smile looked sinister, deceptive. I read the article, feeling a wave of nausea. Arthur was quoted extensively, expressing his profound disappointment and his hope that the church could begin the healing process. He was already writing the narrative, painting himself as the reluctant hero. My first trip to the grocery store was a trial by fire. Heads turned as I walked down the aisles. People who used to greet me with a warm, "Good morning, Father," now fell silent, their whispers following me like a shadow. I could feel their eyes on my back, a mixture of pity, disgust, and morbid curiosity. I grabbed a loaf of bread and some cheese, paid in cash with my head down, and fled back to the anonymity of my motel room, my hands shaking. The isolation was absolute. My phone, which once buzzed constantly with calls and texts from parishioners needing advice or just wanting to chat, went silent. Friends I had known for years suddenly became ghosts. I left a message for Mark, a deacon I had mentored, but he never called back. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a clear and painful message. I was contaminated, and no one wanted to risk being associated with me. A few days later, I saw Mrs. Gable at the post office. I had spent weeks by her husband's bedside when he was dying, holding her hand and praying with her family. She saw me, her eyes widened for a split second, and then she turned away, pretending to be intensely interested in a flyer for a lost cat. That small, deliberate act of erasure hurt more than any headline. It was a denial of everything we had shared, of the comfort I had tried to give her in her darkest hour. The financial pressure mounted quickly. The diocese had frozen my small stipend, and the little savings I had were dwindling fast. The motel bill was due every week, a constant reminder of my precarious situation. I started looking for work, a humbling and deeply embarrassing experience. My resume was 20 years of priesthood. I had no recent references, no practical skills listed that would appeal to a secular employer. I was a 48-year-old man with a tainted name, starting from scratch. One afternoon, I saw a local news report on a TV in a diner. There was Arthur Sterling, cutting a ribbon for a new community center. He was smiling, shaking hands with the mayor, accepting praise for his philanthropy. The reporter called him a, quote, pillar of the community. I watched, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. He was thriving on the ruins of my life, using the very money he'd likely stolen to burnish his own image. His prosperity was a constant public mockery of my suffering. After dozens of rejections, I finally found a job. It was a night shift janitor position at a large distribution warehouse on the outskirts of town. The work was solitary and physically demanding. I spent my nights mopping endless concrete floors and cleaning bathrooms under the harsh glare of industrial lighting. The smell of disinfectant replaced the scent of incense. It was a world away from the altar, a penance for a sin I had never committed. My days were spent in a haze of exhaustion, sleeping in my small room, trying to shut out the world. The nights were long and lonely, filled with the hum of machinery and the echoes of my own thoughts. I started to question everything, even my faith. Where was God in all of this? Why would He allow such a profound injustice to happen? I prayed, but my words felt empty, bouncing off the ceiling and falling back on me like dust. The physical toll was noticeable. I lost weight and dark circles formed under my eyes. The man I saw in the mirror was a stranger, gaunt, tired, and haunted. The light that had once been in my eyes, the one that came from a deep sense of purpose and faith, was gone. I was just a shell, going through the motions of survival, my spirit slowly being eroded by shame and despair. One evening, while buying groceries after my shift, the moment that changed everything happened. I saw a young family, the Millers. I had baptized their 2 children and had personally helped them secure a loan to keep their small business afloat during a tough time. The parents, Sarah and Tom, saw me. For a second, there was recognition and then panic. Sarah quickly grabbed her children's hands and pulled them down another aisle, as if I were a contagion. Their youngest son, little Leo, looked back over his shoulder, his eyes wide with confusion and a hint of fear. He had seen his parents' reaction, and it had taught him to be afraid of me. In that child's eyes, I saw the full extent of my fall. I wasn't just a disgraced priest. I was a monster, in the eyes of a child I had held in my arms and blessed. That was the deepest cut of all. I left my basket in the middle of the aisle and walked out of the store. I sat in my old, beat-up car in the parking lot, the engine off, and for the first time since it all began, I didn't feel despair. I felt a different emotion, Something cold and hard and clear, rising from the depths of my soul. It was anger. A righteous, focused anger that burned away the fog of self-pity. The humiliation was no longer a weight to be carried. It was fuel. Arthur Sterling hadn't just taken my job and my name. He had stolen the trust of my flock, corrupted the sanctity of our church, and turned innocent children against me. He had used the shield of his reputation to commit a great evil, and he had done it with a smile. I realized then that waiting for justice was a fool's game. That night I didn't mop the floors with my head down. I worked with a new energy, a new purpose. My mind, which had been clouded with grief, began to clear. I started to think, to analyze, to plan. The years I had spent in quiet contemplation were over. A different part of me, a part one had long since buried, was beginning to stir. Before I ever heard God's call, I had another life. I was a forensic accountant in Chicago, trained to see the patterns hidden in numbers, to follow the faintest trail of money through the most complex mazes of deceit. I had been one of the best. I left that world seeking a higher purpose, but now I understood. God hadn't asked me to forget those skills. He had been saving them. I went back to my motel room and opened my Bible, but not for comfort. I was looking for a directive. My fingers stopped on a passage in the book of Luke, and the words seemed to leap off the page, written just for me, for this moment. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. It was not a promise of divine intervention. It was a mission statement. The truth was there, buried in ledgers and accounts, and I had the precise skills to unearth it. Arthur Sterling had made a critical mistake. He thought he was destroying a humble priest. He had no idea he had just declared war on an expert whose entire former life was dedicated to exposing men exactly like him. My hands stopped shaking. A profound calm settled over me, the kind that comes only with absolute certainty of purpose. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold resolve. I would not be a victim. I would not wait for the truth to be revealed. I would become the instrument of its revelation. My fall was over. Now, my ascent would begin. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of my room. The tired, haunted man was still there, but his eyes were different. There was a fire in them now, an intelligent, calculating light. I was no longer just Father Michael, the disgraced priest. I was the shepherd who was about to go hunting for the wolf who had scattered his flock. My new ministry was about to begin. It wouldn't take place at an altar, but in the shadows, in the digital world of numbers and spreadsheets. My weapon would not be a crucifix, but a laptop, and my sermons would be delivered, not in words, but in irrefutable proof. I would strip away Arthur's lies layer by layer until his true self was exposed for all to see. The path ahead would be dangerous and lonely, but I was no longer afraid. My faith had not been lost. It had been forged into something stronger, something more active. I was doing God's work, not by turning the other cheek, but by ensuring that wickedness would not prosper in his house. My quest for vengeance was not about personal retribution. It was about restoring a sacred trust and delivering a justice that was long overdue. My old life, the one I had purposefully and prayerfully left behind in Chicago, was built on a foundation of skepticism. I had been a forensic accountant, a man paid to believe that numbers never lie, but people always do. My job was to peel back the layers of complex financial reports to find the rot hidden beneath. I hunted for ghosts in the machine, for the digital footprints of thieves who wore expensive suits and sat on corporate boards. It was a world of logic, data, and the cold, hard certainty of a balanced ledger. I walked away from that world because it felt hollow. The victories were empty, just another rich company getting richer by exposing a rival. I wanted to serve something greater than a bottom line. I wanted to serve God and His people. I traded my spreadsheets for scripture and my corner office for a confessional. For 20 years, I truly believed I had buried that part of myself, that the analytical, suspicious man I once was had been replaced by a man of simple faith. Arthur Sterling's fatal error was that he only saw the priest. He saw a gentle, trusting man who spoke of forgiveness and grace, a man who would be easily broken and discredited. He never imagined that beneath the clerical collar was the mind of a hunter, one who was intimately familiar with the kind of sophisticated fraud he was committing. His arrogance blinded him. He thought he was shearing a sheep, but he had, in fact, provoked a wolf who knew exactly how to track him. The first step was the hardest. I needed information, the real financial records, not the forgeries Arthur had waved in front of the congregation. I was an outcast, forbidden from even setting foot on church grounds. Every door was locked to me, both literally and figuratively. I prayed, not for a miracle to expose him, but for a path to open, for a single ally who still believed. I asked God to send me a sign, a helper, who could be my hands and feet inside the walls I could no longer enter. My prayer was answered by a quiet knock on my motel room door a few nights later. It was Maria, the young woman who worked as the church administrator. She was shy but incredibly sharp, and she loved St. Jude's with a pure heart. She stood there, holding a small basket of food, her eyes filled with a sad, determined light. She hadn't believed the accusations for a second, and the injustice of it all had been weighing on her conscience. She told me she had seen Arthur in the parish office late at night, a few days before he made his public accusation. He was on the main computer, the one that held all the financial records, and he seemed nervous and agitated. It didn't feel right to her. "Father," she whispered, "I don't know what he's doing, but I know you are a good man. Tell me how I can help. Tell me what you need." Her unwavering faith in me was the first true light I had seen in weeks. So I told her everything. I told her about my life in Chicago, about the skills I had left behind. As I spoke, I saw a look of understanding, and then of fierce resolve, dawn on her face. She was brilliant with technology, and knew the church's digital infrastructure better than anyone. She didn't hesitate. She would be my inside source, my partner in uncovering the truth. Our secret covenant was sealed right there in that dingy motel room. A day later, she met me in the back of a quiet library and slipped a small, encrypted USB drive into my hand. It contained a complete, unaltered copy of the church's financial server from the last 5 years. Holding that tiny piece of plastic felt like holding the keys to the kingdom. I rushed back to my room, plugged it into an old second-hand laptop I'd bought with my meager janitor pay, and took a deep breath. The moment I opened the first file, it was as if a dormant part of my soul roared back to life. The complex spreadsheets and transaction logs that would be gibberish to most people were like a beautiful, intricate story to me. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my mind racing, connecting dots and following trails that had been expertly hidden. The skills I thought were long dead were not just present, they were sharper than ever, honed by years of pastoral focus. It took me less than an hour to see it. The missing $50,000 was a smokescreen, a deliberate and clumsy piece of misdirection designed to point squarely at me. The real crime was far bigger, far more insidious. I saw a pattern of strange donations from newly formed corporations, followed by massive payments to construction contractors for projects that were either overpriced or never even happened. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Arthur wasn't just stealing from the church, he was using St. Jude's as a washing machine for dirty money. He was funneling funds from his shady business dealings through the church's charity and building accounts, making it all look like legitimate, tax-exempt activity. He had turned our sacred space into a hub for his criminal enterprise. The depth of his betrayal was staggering. He had defiled our church, exploited the generosity of our congregation, and used the name of God as a shield for his greed. He framed me for stealing from the homeless to prevent anyone from looking closely enough to see that he was poisoning the entire well. My quest was no longer about my own reputation. This was a holy war to reclaim the soul of our parish. Arthur Sterling saw a simple priest and thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He never considered that God might have placed a shepherd in that church who had once been trained to hunt the most clever financial predators on earth. He underestimated my past, and more importantly, he underestimated the power of a faith that had been pushed to its absolute limit. My small motel room, once a cell of despair, became my sanctuary and my war room. The smell of disinfectant on my janitor's uniform was a constant reminder of the humiliation he had forced upon me, but the glow of the laptop screen was the promise of his downfall. I was no longer praying for justice to descend from the heavens. I was forging it myself, with every keystroke and every uncovered transaction. The hunt had begun. The man who had been a forensic accountant was now fully awake, and he was working in service of the priest. I was no longer just Father Michael, the victim. I was the instrument of a reckoning that Arthur Sterling, in all his power and arrogance, would never see coming. He had tried to bury me, but he didn't know that I was a seed, planted by God, with a very specific and now very necessary set of skills. Before I reveal how the revenge happened, it is very important that you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video so that YouTube recommends this incredible story to more people. This way, you help us spread the gospel through real testimonies. So please, help us in this noble cause. The night of the charity gala arrived, a pinnacle of Arthur Sterling's self-made glory. I wasn't there, of course. I was in a small, rented office space across town with a powerful internet connection, my old laptop open before me. Maria had sent me a text message with a photo of the grand ballroom, filled with the town's most influential people. Arthur was on stage, bathed in a golden spotlight, his smile radiating false humility as he spoke of community and integrity. He was at the very peak of his power, a wolf celebrated by the sheep he was devouring. He raised his glass for a toast, a signal for the grand reveal of his new building project. That was my cue. My heart was steady, my hand firm as I moved the cursor over the single file on my desktop. It was a video I had carefully prepared, a simple, clear presentation of every piece of evidence I had uncovered. It showed the money flowing from his shell corporations, through the church's accounts, and into his personal offshore holdings. With a quiet prayer for truth, I clicked the button, sending the file to the gala's audio-visual system through a back door Maria had left open for me. Back in the ballroom, the massive screens behind Arthur, which were supposed to display architectural plans, flickered. The image of a beautiful new chapel dissolved into a stark white screen showing bank statements from the Cayman Islands. Then came the emails, the contracts, the web of deceit laid bare for everyone to see. There were no dramatic accusations, just cold, undeniable facts presented in the clinical language of a forensic audit. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly turning into a wave of shocked silence as the reality of what they were seeing began to sink in. Arthur froze mid-toast, his glass hovering in the air. The confident smile melted from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He turned to look at the screens, and the color drained from his face as he saw his entire criminal enterprise exposed in high definition. He was trapped in the spotlight, his lies unraveling in real time before the very people he had deceived. The silence in the room was broken by a single, horrified gasp from the bishop's table. And then the dam of public opinion broke completely. Just as the chaos began to swell, the grand doors of the ballroom swung open. It wasn't more guests arriving. It was a team of federal agents, their faces grim and professional. 10 minutes before I sent the file, I had made one final anonymous data drop to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The agents moved through the stunned crowd with a clear purpose, their eyes fixed on the man still frozen on the stage. Arthur's influence, his money, his carefully crafted reputation. None of it could protect him now. The law had arrived, not because of his power, but because of the simple, irrefutable truth. The sight of Arthur Sterling, the supposed pillar of our community, being led off his own stage in handcuffs, was a moment of profound, terrible justice. He didn't shout or struggle. He was a broken man, his empire of lies having crumbled around him in less than 5 minutes. The flash of cameras captured his public disgrace, the ultimate price for a man who valued his image above all else. He had used the church as his stage for deception, and God had turned it into the stage for his downfall, ensuring his sins were laid bare for the entire world to see. I watched the news break on my phone. Then I closed my laptop and walked out into the cool night air. I didn't go back to the motel. Instead, I drove to St. Jude's and let myself in with the old key I still had. I sat alone in a back pew, in the quiet darkness of the sanctuary. There was no feeling of triumph, no joy in another man's ruin. There was only a deep, solemn peace. The truth had been brought into the light. My name was cleared, but more importantly, the sanctity of this house had been defended. My silent war was over. Justice had been served.